Tomorrow, Alabama will vote on what could become the strictest abortion law in the nation. If passed, Alabama would make it a felony for a doctor to perform or attempt an abortion during any stage of pregnancy, with no exception for rape or incest. Now, this comes after Georgia passed the so-called heartbeat bill last week, which bans abortions after a fetal heartbeat is detected. That's usually around 6 weeks into pregnancy. Many women don't even know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. Georgia became the fourth state this year to pass a heartbeat bill, following Mississippi, Ohio, and Kentucky. Similar bills are in the works in 10 other states. 28 state legislatures have introduced several bans so far in 2019. These bills ban abortion in a variety of ways, prohibiting abortion at a certain point in pregnancy, placing bans based on fetal characteristics, or barring providers from specific types of abortions. Now, some states have introduced bills that put restrictions on health care centers that perform abortions, like requiring hallways to measure a certain width. Some states require a woman to view a mandatory ultrasound before getting an abortion, and others are trying to eliminate funding for Planned Parenthood, which also provides services like yearly checkups. The goal of all of this is to get cases to the doorstep of the Supreme Court in an attempt to overturn Roe v. Wade. This is the landmark 1973 decision that legalized abortion nationwide. 6 states have passed laws that are directly meant to challenge Roe. Another 6 have passed trigger laws, which would automatically ban abortion if the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade. Joining me now is the president and executive director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, Kristen Clarke. Kristen, thank you for being with us. These cases, these various cases that we're talking about, not the trigger cases, but the ones that are sort of meant to get to the Supreme Court, how many are we talking about, and how close are they to actually being Supreme Court cases?
Well, most certainly there is a coordinated attack on Roe v. Wade that is unfolding across the country right now. Whether you're talking about the heartbeat bill in Georgia, the pending abortion ban in Alabama, Ohio, there are a number of states that have passed laws that are clearly intended to run in conflict with the court's precedent in Roe. And the end goal is to reopen the court's precedents when it comes to Roe and have a newly configured court reinterpret the court's precedent here. Now, this morning, the Supreme Court issued a ruling in a separate case involving state sovereignty. But what's most notable about the ruling is that the opinion was authored by Justice Thomas and joined by Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Roberts, and Alito, and overturns well-settled precedent that's been in place for 40 years, and there was no reason that they had to do this. It calls into question whether this is a court that will respect the principle of stare decisis, which says that you respect longstanding settled law, and you are guided by those firm precedents that are in place. And it suggests that this is a court that is well positioned to reopen Roe when these cases land on its doorstep. And, this is a case that we should all be very, very concerned about.
So where are we in this, given that these states, as you say, now feel emboldened that the Supreme Court has a solid conservative majority? How likely is it that something will appear before the court?
I think it's highly likely. I mean, in Alabama, they are racing forward with a law that they say they know conflicts with Roe v. Wade. And there are lawmakers who are saying, hey, our goal is to get this case to the Supreme Court. They know that there are 2 justices that sit on the court who have been appointed by President Trump. So these are states that want the Supreme Court to reopen longstanding precedents. And it's not just with respect to Roe v. Wade. We're also seeing a coordinated attack on affirmative action. And we are defending 2 cases that are challenging affirmative action at Harvard University and the University of North Carolina. And the end goal is the same, to have the court reopen its precedents, which have long said that you can have race-conscious admissions policies in the higher ed context. And you got to think about what's happening in the backdrop here. President Trump has now appointed over 100 judges to our nation's federal courts. He has made clear that his goal is to appoint judges who will overturn Roe and various other aspects of civil rights in our country. So We should sound an alarm here. We want courts that will adhere to the rule of law. They are supposed to act as a check on excesses from lawmakers and from the executive branch. And once we throw that out the window, then we're in a state of constitutional crisis.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.